The subject of today's podcast is a multifaceted, innovative, and revolutionary Torah giant whose impact on the Jewish people resonates until today. This was a man of complex, creative, and diverse personality, a titanic intellect, a deep thinker with a prescient sense of where things are going for the Jewish people, a towering personality who was the Gadol Adar, the greatest Jew of his time for many decades, Rabbi Yisrael Lipkin, known to all as Reb Yisrael Salanter, 1810 to 1883. He was born in a small shtetl near Kovna called Zyder, and his father was a rabbi, eventually became the rabbi of the city of Telz. And the one thing that is a standout about his childhood and really throughout his whole life was that he was brilliant beyond words. And I think this is something we repeat again and again when talking about great Jewish leaders, is their intellectual ability. And I would say it's not surprising that many of the greatest and most impactful leaders of Jewish history were geniuses, and perhaps great intellect is a prerequisite to changing the world. But the truth is that geniuses come amongst the Jewish people a dime a dozen. Having ability to change the world in itself doesn't necessarily mean that you will indeed do that. It's those select few that harness their abilities to the max and have the strength of character and vision and personality and the help from the Almighty who actually succeed in affecting the nation at large. That said, Reb Yisrael was an otherworldly intellect who employed his mind to the max. Later on in his life, he abruptly passed out on the street and became temporarily paralyzed because of a stroke. And the doctors told him that the reason why he had a stroke was due to the constant strain he exerted on his brain. He was thinking at all times with such intensity, with such depth, that his brain was an overload and crashed. And the doctors told him, you have to have a minimum of 2 hours a day where you're not thinking so deeply. And that's when he began smoking, which was much more common then than it is today, as a way to clear his mind from thinking. He had to distract himself to not think on a very deep level. At the age of 10, Reb Yisrael gave a pilpul, which is a complex didactic lecture on Talmud in the local Beis Medrash. Of course, a 10-year-old, that shows that he was distinct and a great scholar from the very beginning. At the age of 14, he sent a kuntrist, a booklet of novel Torah insights, to Rabbi Akiva Eger, who didn't respond. But we know from another source, it's documented that someone went to visit Rabbi Akiva Eger, and he told him that there's a 14-year-old from Salant, and he sent me a kuntrist, which is Geoinus Atzuma, which means astonishing genius. And his Torah erudition and genius earned him the nickname as the Alfasi Katan, the small Alfasi. If you remember, in the 11th century, we met one of the titans of the medieval Jewish world, Rabbi Yitzchak Alfasi from Fez, and in the 19th century, Reb Yisrael Salanter, as a young man, was given that nickname. Later on, he would talk about his ability by saying, I have the mind of 1,000 men, and therefore I have the responsibility of 1,000 men. It's not the way of Mussar for someone to ignore their abilities, but to have a deep recognition of them and also to understand that abilities come from God and thus they create responsibility. And also, very early in life, Reb Yisrael exhibited uncommon, tenacious willpower and character, and a total disinterest in non-spiritual matters. He was famous for many axioms, many aphorisms that he would say. One of them was that this world is like an expensive hotel, replete with amenities, with food, with alcoholic beverages, and you walk into the room and you say, oh, it's all seemingly free. And you spend your time in the hotel and you're imbibing on all these free goodies. But when you come to check out, you receive an enormous bill. And all the things that you partook in with exorbitant prices, you're left with a tremendous, hefty bill to pay at the end. And he would say, we can indulge in this world and not pay anything up front. It's like the expensive hotel. But we will have to pay astronomical prices for all that we indulge in the physical world once we get to the next world, once we check out, so to speak, of this world. However, he said there is one way to avoid pain. There is someone who can go to the hotel, the proverbial hotel, and partake in whatever he wants and not have to worry about the consequences. If you have a diplomat or an ambassador with an expense account paid for by his country, he doesn't need to worry about the hotel bills. It's covered by other people. He says our objective is to make it our business to be an ambassador of God into this world, to be representing God in this world, and then we have an expense account, and we can consume whatever we want over the course of fulfilling our mission, and that won't detract. We don't have to pay that bill. That said, his whole life he refrained from partaking in physical pleasures to the extreme. Rabbi Shlomo Elyashiv, a famous Kabbalist from the 19th century, wrote the book Leshem Shebo V'Achlam, and his grandson became the premier halachic authority of the end of the 20th century. He would say about Reb Yisrael Salanter, he took no pleasure in this world, he despised honor, he hated money, and he didn't even spend time with frolicking with his kids. And these are the things that connect us most to this world, and he abstained from it. When Rabbi Yisrael turned bar mitzvah when he was 13, he decided that the one food that he loved more than any else, potato latkes, he would never eat it. And then a year later, it was not so uncommon for kids to get married quite young. So when he's 14 years old, he gets engaged and he goes to visit the home of his future in-laws. And they provide a plate of latkes right before him. So he sees the latkes, and it's been a year since he's had one, and they look delicious. But he made a decision to not consume these ever again. But how could he say no? How could he offend his hosts who are offering him food? So he decided after this internal debate, which one of these two bad options should he choose? And he decided to eat the latkes. And he later on would say that he regretted that decision for the rest of his life. This shows us, I think, two things. First of all, that he was an ascetic with regards to this world and partaking in matters of this world. But also it shows a methodology of making choices. Whenever you have two options, you have to weigh, like a judge would perhaps, the pros and cons, the merits of each choice. Do I eat it and transgress my pledge to not eat it? Or do I refrain and withhold from eating it and then offend other people and maybe cause them to be embarrassed or ashamed? And this process of deconstructing an action, a decision, a choice, and character, it would eventually become a staple of Mussar. And even when people do mitzvos, so we think of a mitzvah as being a monolithic act. Someone studies Torah, somebody does charity, someone acts benevolently, someone does chesed, kindness. The Mussar masters would always try to take a action and disassemble it and deconstruct it and find out, are you really sure that there's no sinful undertones and the action is truly untainted? Maybe someone's acting in a kind way because they want to be acknowledged and they want to be recognized and they want to get a pat on the back and they want to be honored and they want to receive plaudits. Maybe someone's studying Torah to demonstrate their brilliantness. And what Mussar came on to demand is intensive insight and wisdom and self-knowledge and self-critique to analyze decisions and to try to rectify and cleanse and purify so that we reach ethical refinement. There's another amazing story that shows his decision-making process. My favorite story of all stories. And he, like we said earlier, he used to smoke. And one time he woke up in the middle of the night and he wanted a cigarette and he didn't have any. And the problem was that There is the only place that sold cigarettes at that time of the night was a significant walk away, maybe a mile away. So it's the middle of the night, and he's faced with two choices. Does he go back to sleep? Or does he go and get up and get dressed and make the trek down to the store and buy the cigarettes? And of course, there's merits on each side, but there's also dangers on each side. What if someone is too lazy to get up, make the trip, and get those cigarettes? Well, then he's reinforcing a certain negative character within him. We have an innate tendency towards laziness, towards non-action, and thus going back to sleep would reinforce that. Well, what about the other side? What if he gets up and gets dressed and makes the long trip and goes and buys the cigarettes and smokes the cigarettes? Well, then he's reinforcing a second negative character, and that is desire. You're so desirous of a physical pleasure, and thus you get up and middle of the night, you're walking for a mile, and that's reinforcing your connection to that. So either one is bad choices. So in a classical Mussar way, Reb Yisrael invented a third option. He gets up, and he gets dressed, and he makes the trip. And by doing that, he stamps out a little bit of the tendency towards laziness. And he arrives at the shop, and he doesn't buy the cigarettes. And thus, he resists and repels and rejects the second negative characteristic, the one that says, okay, imbibe and indulge in pleasures. He goes back home and goes back to sleep. In our world, we're not used to thinking about actions and character on such a deep level. And Rabbi Yisrael, he would plumb to the depths of man and try to understand the makeup and the tendencies of a person to unfathomable depths, as we shall see, continues to see. Now, in his during his teens, he discovered Rabbi Yosef Zundel of Salanter. This was a hidden tzaddik, a hidden righteous person. This was a common thing that people would do. They would try to conceal as much as they can their personal piety and their personal character. So this great rabbi, who was a student of Rabbi Chaim of Volozhin, he was masquerading as a water carrier. And he didn't give any lectures, and he didn't have any recognition. He never held any rabbinic posts. But a young Reb Yisrael Salanter recognized that this is a man of tremendous greatness, and he would stalk him. And he would see his teacher walking into the woods and having contemplation. And Reb Yisrael would creep behind him, following and trying to analyze his every move. At one time, while following him in the woods, he stepped on some branch or made some noise, and Rabbi Yosef Zundel turned around and said to him a line that he said resonated within him for the rest of his life. He said to me, Yisrael, study Mussar. If you study Mussar, you'll become a Yerushalayim. You'll have fear of heaven. And he said this message went straight through him and touched him, and he decided to dedicate himself to Mussar as well. After a very long and fruitful career, Reb Yisrael Salanter said about himself that all of his achievements, despite all of effectively changing the world, changing the Jewish world in a great way, his greatness, he has not yet achieved the ankles of Reb Zundel, his teacher. He remained in Salanter for 18 years, and in 1840, he moved to Vilna. Vilna, as we've said before, was the Jerusalem of Lithuania. It was the biggest and most robust Jewish city in Lithuania, which was then in the Russian Empire. Today, it's its own independent country. And he became a teacher in the yeshiva, the famous Ramaylis yeshiva in Vilna. Now, after a year or two, he recognized that he was more beloved by the students than the head of the yeshiva, and he decided to leave and open up his own yeshiva in Vilna. Now, though he had a local role and a local position, his focus was on the nation in crisis. And by that time, reform was all the rage in Germany. And there was a rapid repudiation of Torah that terrified everyone. And for example, when we've spoken about this before, in 1844, there was a rabbinic conference in Brunswick in Germany where they officially baked into the charter of German reform repudiation of Torah, of halacha. They formally ruled that intermarriage was okay, provided that the spouse is from a monotheistic religion. And when he was analyzing that, Reb Yisrael said, he made a prescient and tragic prediction, saying that the rabbis in Brunswick, they repudiated the Shulchan Aruch, they repudiated the code of Jewish law. A time will come where the Gentiles will impose the Shulchan Aruch back upon them. And indeed, 91 years later, Germany adopted the Nuremberg laws, and thus in the same country where Jews ruled that intermarriage was acceptable, the Gentiles ruled that it was not. And under those conditions, indeed, halacha was restored as Rabbi Yisrael predicted nearly a century prior. But in Western Europe, it was a very dire time for Torah and for Jewry. And by the 1840s, the winds of change were not limited to Germany. The tentacles of the reform's sister, the Haskalah, were rapidly reeling in the Jews of Lithuania and Russia. These mastilim, these quote-unquote enlightened Jews, they had a deep-seated hatred for Torah and for the students of Torah, and they would employ the Russian government to aid their dismantling of Torah infrastructure. They would have rabbis, for example, replaced with assimilated, government-recognized religious preachers. And there was a trend. Jews were moving out of their shtetls. The rabbis don't have any influence over them. They're moving to cities. They're joining universities. And sadly, those conditions allowed for many Jews to disappear from their nation. And this is especially true with respect to bright and intelligent people who, for the first time, were exposed to secular books and literature and thought and sophistication, and were increasingly vulnerable to being swept away in the tides of Haskalah and being lost to their people. And there was no real widespread intellectual counterpart in the religious Torah world that could compete with what was then a burning desire for enlightenment, for the profound, for the scientific, for reason. What the Jewish world had to offer instead was the traveling maggid. These were fixtures in Eastern European Jewry, and these were speakers who would travel from shtetl to shtetl and town to town and city to city, and they give inspirational speeches to the Jewish congregation, get paid, and move on to the next town. But these people, they were storytellers. They were funny, they were entertaining, they were witty, they were sharp, and they would inspire, ostensibly, the people. But the serious scholars, they didn't show up. This was perhaps could be described as entertainment with religious twist to it. It wouldn't fill a void for a young, ambitious man who dreams of being a great scientist or philosopher. Now, these new challenges from without, this changing world, were compounded by threats from within. As was the case in Germany, we mentioned a few episodes ago, Rav Hirsch commented that in Germany there were reverse Marranos, people who were Jewish on the outside, externally religious and observant and pious, but devoid of Judaism within. The passion for Torah and Judaism amongst the Jews of Eastern Europe was swiftly eroding. And Reb Yisrael recognized, and it's evident today, amongst any group of our nation who are not instilled with passion and meaning and inspiration of Judaism, religious people and religious communities of this ilk have a very short shelf life. It doesn't perpetuate. Passionateless Judaism will invariably diminish and eventually die out. And it's clear to us now, as it was to Israel at the time, that the Jewish nation was at a critical juncture. And innovative and bold approaches were needed to solve these grave problems. And he began what became known as the Mussar Movement. It was aimed at addressing both of the unique challenges of the time. It was a movement for the elite, for the searching, for the intellectuals, and it was oriented around real, deep, inspirational, meaningful, passionate Torah and mitzvos. Now, the movement was a runaway success on one hand, but arguably somewhat of a failure on the other. It did not succeed in creating a mass shift or trend in the nation at large, nor in halting the progress of Haskalah on a national level. However, it did succeed in crafting a cadre of giants of Mussar, men of astounding personal character and greatness, and eventually, as we will see, the Mussar movement joined forces and merged with the modern yeshiva movement, which together, a Mussar with the yeshiva, it turned into an unstoppable force that still lives on today with the vibrancy and the flourishing of the yeshiva world. Now, aside from the Mussar movement, Reb Yisrael, he tried various means to save the nation. He wanted to test out everything in the world. Anything that held out any hope of saving world Jewry from the Haskalah, he wanted to tinker with. He even tried Hasidus, though it's not clear to what extent. As an aside, my grandfather wrote in a letter that Reb Yisrael did not oppose Hasidus, rather he complemented it and deepened it. He even experimented with the education of his son, Yom Tov Lipkin, and two students by allowing them to attend university. Eventually, this actually created a big hubbub when Haskalah publications, they claimed that Rabbi Yisrael was in favor of sending Jewish boys to college, to university. Look, he sent his son to university. And obviously he must be in favor. And he responded by publishing in 1865 a disavowal of his young son's behavior. And he pleads to anyone who has any influence on him, bring him back to me, bring him back to Torah. Now, this son, youngest son of Reb Yisrael, Yom Tov Lipkin, he tragically died at the age of 30 from smallpox. And before he died at the end of his life, he actually did repent and return to Judaism. But he became a great mathematician, and he invented what became known as the Lipkin parallelogram, a mechanism, a mathematical mechanism. And that was Reb Yisrael's son who went to university. The other two students who went to university, the other two guinea pigs, perhaps, of this experiment, they abandoned Jewry altogether. And there's a story about one of them, a Dr. Einhorn, who became a military doctor, but he intermarried, and then he went crazy. And he was living in Vienna with his non-Jewish wife and children, and in a fit of insanity, he lit his own house on fire, and he fled across the border to Russia, and he became this eccentric penitent who would just hang out in local synagogues. And apparently he would wear tefillin all day, and he would give medical advice and medical services to local Jews. That was a student of Reb Yisrael Salanter who went to university and went a little bit awry. Now, after these failed experiments, Reb Yisrael, he didn't approve at all of any secular studies program. He went the entirely opposite direction, and he didn't allow even in yeshivas that were controlled by his own disciples, he didn't allow them to have even a rudimentary secular studies program. But let's talk about the Mussar movement. It's important for us to clear away misconceptions. Mussar is not an ideology. It's not a worldview. It's not a religious theory. What exactly is Mussar, and what was this movement? So I think a good way to define Mussar is that Mussar is the tool to integrate Torah into man. Mussar is going to enable the Torah to affect a person, to change, to improve, to cleanse himself from all bad character and behavior until man can reach ethical purity and personal perfection. It's not a new type of study. It's a format of study of Torah. It's a format of inculcating, integrating, and self-application of Torah study. In a letter that Reb Yisrael Salanter wrote to his student, a series of which were published posthumously under the name Or Yisrael, Reb Yisrael writes, quote, "Transforming a person from bad to good without Mussar is like attempting to see without an eye and to hear without an ear. Mussar is the tools for unlocking and unleashing the power of Torah so it can change and transform a person." Their motto, one of the mottos of the Mussar movement, Kol zman shahaner dolek od efshar letaken. As long as the candle yet burns, it is possible to repair. So long as the candle of one's soul is yet vibrant, he can still rectify and repair his character. Where does that story come from? So we're told that, or legend has it, that Reb Yisrael Salanter brought he saw a shoemaker. Did he bring the shoes or did he not bring the shoes? That's different versions of the story. But he saw a light, a candle burning in the middle of the night. So he went to investigate and he finds a shoemaker hard at work. And he asks him, well, till when are you going to work fixing shoes? So the shoemaker points at the candle and says, well, so long as the candle is yet burning, I'm going to fix shoes. And this simple, casual encounter wouldn't mean much to us, but Mussar is applying Torah to ourselves, but focusing inwardly and applying whatever we encounter to ourselves. So Reb Yisrael took this just simple sentence and made it into the motto of Mussar. And I think it's kind of fitting that a simple encounter with a shoemaker that for a non-Mussar man would leave no impression at all, it would end up personifying the movement that espouse self-application, even about things that others would consider minor. Now, so what are the components of Mussar and the Mussar movement? So I think first, to successfully change a person, well, that demands a deep understanding of the inner workings of that said person. This depth of understanding of humans was a hallmark of all the great Mussar masters. For example, several years after World War I, the great Rabbi Yerucham Levovitz, a Mussar master par excellence, he returned to Mir after being absent for many years due to the war. And after 3 months being in the yeshiva with 300 students, he said, I know all the good character, all the midos, all the attributes, the character traits of all 300 students, the positive character. And for most of them, I understand the elements of their character that need to be fixed. That's an example of the depth of understanding of humans that was the hallmark of great Mussar masters. Rabbi Yisrael himself was an absolute genius in human psychology in general and individuals. For example, the notion of the unconscious mind, the idea upon which modern psychoanalysis is built, that was discovered by him 40 years before it was popularized by Sigmund Freud. He writes that he asks a question. The Midrash says that when Abraham was sacrificing Isaac, or attempting to sacrifice Isaac, his eyes were dripping with tears. He was very sad. Yet there's another source that says that God testifies that Abraham was 100% committed and had no resistance towards doing this act of sacrificing his son for God. So how do they reconcile with each other? How could he be both sad and crying, but be totally committed? So Reb Yisrael explains by giving a mashal, a parable. Suppose a teacher or a rabbi has a son who's not the greatest kid in the world. He's a good for nothing. And he also has a student who's a star success. So whenever he sees the student, he smiles. He's delighted. And when he sees his son, he frowns. He's not so happy with him. But suppose, in the middle of the night, a fire breaks out, and both his son and his student are amid the inferno. Instinctively, he's going to run and grab his son first, and only then the student. On the outer layers, on the conscious mind, he is closer to his student. But on the unconscious mind, inside, he has a stronger bond with his son. And similarly, with regards to Abraham, consciously, Abraham was doing it entirely wholeheartedly. But unconsciously, there's an element of the paternal love that caused him to be weeping over this event. And it's interesting, after a Torah giant unlocks a truth, Reb Yisrael Salanter unlocks this truth of this found in the spiritual world. Once it's brought into this world on a spiritual cosmic level, it becomes discoverable even by those that are not connected to this world. I'm not trying to say that Freud read the works of Reb Yisrael Salanter and that's where he got his idea. I'm not suggesting that. What I am suggesting is that once on a cosmic level, a truth, a Torah truth, a spiritual truth in reality gets brought down to this world, it becomes possible for others, even those not connected to this world, to access it. So the first thing about a Mussar is self-understanding. But to gain self-understanding, you have to have self-discovery. You have to acquire a deep and exhaustive catalog of personal attributes, both good and bad. And then hence, the Mussar practice of setting aside designated times for self-reflection, for character rumination, to dwell on behavior, and to try to isolate the fulcra of behavior. What's really at play? What really is motivating people to behave in a certain way? What is a truth based upon an intellectual process? And what's just a delusion, a fantasy, if you will, that needs to be avoided? And as a component of this, the Mussar masters would always be eager to hear from their detractors. The people who think negatively about you, your enemies, they don't face the same obstacles in pinpointing your flaws. Thus, if you want to have self-discovery, you should listen and hearken to what your enemies say, because their character assessments are pure gold. We tend to recoil and lash out and contradict pointed criticism from our haters, despite the fact, or maybe precisely because of the fact, that we have a niggling suspicion that they're actually hitting the nail on the head. Rabbi Yisrael will quote the verse in Psalms 92, B'kamim alai mireim, tishmana oznai. When those who would harm me rise up against me, my ears have heard. He would interpret this to mean, when my enemies speak ill of me, my ears perk up, because there's likely some truth in their words and truth that I need if I want to fix myself, and truth that would be otherwise very difficult to access. Now, of course, self-cognizance is terrifying. No one wants to think that they're bad people. And that's, again, one of the obstacles you're going to face if you want to do Mussar, the way Reb Yisrael outlined, is that we have a tendency to try to deflect any sort of criticism because it makes us feel incomplete. It makes us come to terms and have to face up with the fact that we do have flaws. Now, the giants of Mussar, they would do this by design. And thus, it's not uncommon to find the giants of Mussar to speak about themselves very disparagingly. There was once a story where Reb Yisrael Salanter, he was giving a lecture. And he looks up and he sees right above his head, there's a large chandelier. So he gets down from the podium and he says, I cannot speak over there. I can't give a lecture from there because I think from my actions, I am guilty of a capital offense. And I think it's quite likely that the chandelier will collapse on top of me and kill me. And I don't want to put myself in danger. And of course, his character and his greatness and his holiness is unimpeachable. But the Mussar masters train themselves to try to come to terms with the fact that they have flaws. And those flaws are serious. And those flaws are deep-rooted. And it became their mission to try to fix them. He said about himself, I don't trust myself to be left alone in a room with someone else's uncounted money. If someone else leaves a pile of cash here that they didn't count, I cannot trust myself to be left in the room with it because who knows, maybe I'll steal it. And one of his Mussar master successors said about himself, I don't trust myself with someone else's counted money. Even if the other person counted the money, I don't want to be left alone in a room with it. I think it's a recognition of how deep-rooted someone's corruption goes also impresses upon him how difficult it is to change. Reb Yisrael would say, it's easier to finish all of Talmud and to know it than it is to change a single character. Character is almost baked in. It's almost hardwired to who we are. And to change it, it demands a lot of hard work. Now, it's interesting that in trying to influence himself, or one of his elements of personal philosophy and a theme that he would employ to try to influence others, was the idea of fear of punishment. Fear is the greatest of motivators. And thus, if you want to influence others, you want to coax recalcitrant brothers back to Torah, it's one of the most potent tools to do that. But, as a caveat, it's important to recognize that it's a very volatile and dangerous tool. But Rabbi Yisrael would base a lot of his spiritual work on fear of punishment. Why am I doing mitzvos? Why am I withholding from sins? Because I don't want to be punished by God. And he would stress that it's insufficient for someone to know what punishment the Almighty metes out for sins. He said someone has to create vivid visualizations in their mind's eye of what it's going to be like. And he once told someone, let me explain to you, give you a picture, an image, an illustration of what Gehenna is, of what purgatory or hell is like. He said, imagine you place your finger in a fire for 5 seconds. Now imagine that pain spread over the surface of your whole body. Now imagine that for a whole year. That's Gehenna. Obviously, that's terrifying, and maybe under certain conditions would be very motivating. Now, when asked why he doesn't study Kabbalah, he responded, well, what do I care in which firmament of the spiritual spheres the Almighty is? All I know is that as punishment for every sin in heaven, I will be whipped with streams of fire, and it will hurt very much. Along these lines, Rabbi Yisrael employed a Jewish version of Pascal's wager, which argues that a rational person should behave as though God exists and seek to believe in God, because if God does not exist, you don't lose anything, or what you lose is very limited, some pleasures. Whereas if God does exist, then there's infinite gains, and you're avoiding infinite losses. So Reb Yisrael had a Jewish version of this. He would tell people, especially later on in his life when he would go to Germany and France to try to reach out to Jews that had strayed very far from observance. He would tell them, he says, suppose you had a traveler, a weary and thirsty traveler who arrives to town. And he's so thirsty, and the townspeople, they give him a glass of water. And as he's about to drink the glass of water to quench his thirst, someone shows up and says, wait, don't drink that water. That water is poisoned, and I swear to you, if you drink the water, you're going to die. And all the townspeople say, don't listen to this guy. He's out of his mind. He's crazy. You have nothing to worry. Just drink the water. So Reb Yisrael would say, would you take the risk? Even if you're very thirsty, and even if it's only one person saying the water is tainted, you shouldn't take the risk. It's illogical for a person to take the risk because the potential result of dying because of poison outweighs the benefits. And even if the person is making up the whole story, you don't know for sure. And he would tell them, maybe I'm that crazy old man. I may be wrong. But I'm telling you that the Torah says that someone who desecrates Shabbos will suffer unimaginable eternal torment and have their soul disenfranchised. And you know what? Maybe I am an old loon. But perhaps, just maybe, I'm not crazy. Is it worth to take the chance? Again, we see how he would use fear of punishment as a tool to motivate people to re-embrace Torah. Now, another element that became deeply connected to Mussar was the focus on interpersonal mitzvos. As we mentioned, Reb Yisrael recognized that religious Jews were very good at being religious, and they were experts at dotting the I's and crossing the T's of observance. But their Judaism was devoid of realness, of passion, of meaning. And as such, they neglected interpersonal mitzvos between man and one's fellow. And the story is told that he was once praying next to someone on Yom Kippur. And the person was praying with such fervor, and he was crying and sobbing that Rabbi Yisrael, he says, I wanted to pray from such a book, from such a machzor, a book of prayers that were drenched in tears. So he leaned in to try to read from the words of the person standing next to him, and the person shoved him back. Like, no, this is my book. Like, don't peek in. And it's just striking that someone can be so immersed in Torah and Judaism, but be so far from the real purpose of what it should be doing to them, of how it should be transforming him into a greater person. And therefore, there's a need to educate the masses on the essence of what Torah is really trying to do to us and try to utilize it and maximize the impact that it can have in our lives. He would talk about someone who wants to hear the lecture, the speech of the Maggid. Well, that's a good thing, right? There's someone coming to town, a great rabbi, and he's going to give a talk, and he's going to be inspiring and teach you about mitzvos and Torah. And that's a good thing. But the person wants to go, so he's running. He's a little bit late. He looks at his clock. He's 5 minutes late. And he's running, and he's knocking over people and knocking over displays, and he's able to bump into 10 people and disrupt 10 people because he wants to have a spiritual uplifting. Says, well, that anything that you may gain on a spiritual level is vastly outweighed by what you will use. And Mussar is about having Torah penetrate us and changing us. And if we're really changed by Torah, then it will be manifest in our interactions with other people. And therefore, whenever he studied and whenever he taught, he would always strive to glean a practical, actionable insight from any section of Talmud. So, for example, the Talmud talks about shar shenadach es hapara. If you have an ox and the ox gores the cow, and the question is there's now a dead calf next to the cow, and we don't know if the calf was born and died irrespective of the ox, or did the ox gore the cow and that caused her to miscarry? And thus, the question is, does the owner of the ox need to pay the owner of the cow for the calf separately or not? So that seems to be entirely removed from any sort of ethical undertones. But Reb Yisrael Salanter would understand this whole, or would teach or draw a lesson about Lashon Hara, about evil gossip from this particular story. And there's a few famous aphorisms about making Torah real and about correct interpersonal attitudes that he would say. For example, the beginning of the book of Bab Metzia talks about two people who come to court, each of them grabbing hold onto half of a garment, and each one of them claiming that they own the entire garment, and the other person, he just grabbed it. It's really mine. So the Mishnah says that the halacha is that they have to split it. So they sell the garment and they split the proceeds between the two people, each one who's holding half of it and claiming half of it, and claiming the whole of the entirety of it. How would Reb Yisrael Salanter teach that? He says two people are holding onto the garment. Each one says it's entirely mine. Says the Almighty, they should split it. It's important for people when they study, when you're immersed in Talmud, you have to remember where this comes from. This comes from God. Every time it says Amar Mar, which means the master said, we don't know who it is, says Reb Yisrael Salanter, it's reminding you that Amar Mar says the master of the world is really speaking here in the pages of the Talmud. Some other lines that he would say that became very famous axioms of Mussar. Someone else's physical needs are my spiritual needs. Someone else needs something to improve their body. I improve my soul by taking care of my neighbor's body. Your heart is reshus hayachid. Your heart is your own private domain. However, your face, that's reshus harabim. That's the public domain. You're depressed. You're sad. You have some grief. You have no right to impose that upon other people. I know his sensitivity to other people was legendary. There's a few famous stories I want to share here. One of the most famous ones was that Reb Yisrael Salanter was walking to shul on the night of Yom Kippur, and he hears a baby crying. Apparently, the mother had left the baby with a 9-year-old daughter so that she could go to shul. So she's motivated, she's inspired, and she wants to go to shul, so she leaves the baby with her daughter, who's 9 years old. So Reb Yisrael hears the baby crying and runs to see what he could do to help. And he prepares a bottle for the baby. And he's about to leave, and he sees that this young girl is very scared and doesn't want him to leave. So he stays. And he misses the entire Kol Nidre, one of the most famous prayers of the year. He misses it because he's there with two young children who are scared. And his rationale is, listen, praying is a mitzvah of rabbinic origin. But chesed, kindness, that's one of the greatest mitzvahs in the Torah. And if I have a choice between the two, I have to choose the chesed. The story is told that he was traveling in a wagon with students. And the students are talking about the most erudite matters of Talmud and Jewish philosophy. And he keeps on changing and steering the conversation to the most simple matters. And afterwards, they say to him, you're someone who's always talking about Torah. Why are you always changing the conversation to talk about simple things? He says, well, we have a wagon driver. This is a simple Jewish peasant, and we have no right to discuss lofty Torah matters and to disinclude him from the conversation because we want to study Torah. If you are going to do a mitzvah, but make someone else feel bad as a result, is that really a mitzvah? Another story is told that he was traveling once, and he arrived at a given town for Shabbos, and all the people of the town are clamoring to have the great Rabbi Yisrael Salanter come to them for Shabbos. So he ends up by one of the hosts, and they arrive home from shul, and the host notices that the challah is not covered as per the custom. So he starts screaming at his wife, and she says, "Why is the challah not covered?" And the wife is scrambling, and she's apologizing, and she quickly runs to get the cover for the challah. So Reb Yisrael asks this individual, why do we cover the challah? Why is this tradition that when someone makes kiddush on Friday night, you have the challah covered? And the man looks at him quizzically. Of course, you're the famous rabbi. Of course you know the reason why. Because typically we always make the bracha, the blessing on bread first. And on Shabbos, we have to make the blessing on the wine first. And therefore, we don't want to embarrass the bread. So Reb Yisrael says to him, wait, don't you just hear what you said? We go to great lengths to not embarrass the challah, the bread. It's inanimate. It doesn't have any feelings. But you're embarrassing your wife publicly? You're behaving. You're following the ritual. You're doing what you're supposed to do, but you're missing the point. You're missing the message. There was once a time that he was washing his hands at a wedding before eating bread. And he washed his hands only till the joints. And his students noticed this, and they say, wait a minute, doesn't the Talmud say that although one is obligated to wash the hands only to the joint, but there's a special benefit. It's a better mitzvah when you pour on the whole hand and use a significant amount of water. And Reb Yisrael Salanter responded, but look, there's a water carrier who has to go to the well and has to schlep all the water so we can wash our hands. I have no right to impose my stringency. I want to wash my whole hand. But you know what? On the back of someone else's labor, I can't impose my stringencies. One final story here. The story is told that he had a yahrzeit for his father. And the tradition is, halacha is, that when someone has a yahrzeit for their parent, they should try to lead the services on that day. And as he wants to lead the services, another person shoves him out of the way. And he says, well, I have a yahrzeit for my daughter, and I want to lead the services. So Reb Yisrael, he stepped aside and allowed that person to lead the services, to be the chazan. And the students asked him, the halacha actually states that whenever there is a question of who comes first, someone who has a yahrzeit for their parent, someone who has a yahrzeit for their child, the one who has the yahrzeit for the parent comes first. So why did you allow him to go ahead of you? He says, well, what's the whole idea of leading the prayers on the day of the yahrzeit, the day of the anniversary of the death of your father? It's because to do something good, to do a meritorious act that's going to provide a benefit and ascension for the soul of the deceased. Well, I'm doing a mitzvah here. There is a Jew who's having a tough day, who lost a child, and I did a mitzvah of giving him the right to lead the services. Let that be the merit for my deceased father. These are some of the ideas and attitudes of the Mussar movement. What about the practical implication of this movement? So, of course, above all, it is Mussar study. It's the study of ethical teachings of Torah. Now, Reb Yisrael did not invent the idea of Mussar study. In fact, the great Mussar books, they're hundreds of years old at the time. The great book by the Ramchal, The Path of the Just, actually became the seminal work of Mussar and of the Mussar movement. But he promulgated not to study Mussar, but how to study Mussar, a format of Mussar study in a way that it would unlock the sealed hearts and unleash its potency and its power. Mussar and the Mussar movement was studied aloud in a sing-song with sfasayim dolkos, with lips that are aflame. Rabbi Yisrael taught, if you read a sentence and you're not impassioned by it yet, you read it again. And you read it again and repeat it until it's within you. It resonates within you. It's exploding inside of you. And then it's actually going to change you from within. Another aspect of the Mussar movement was the innovation of the Mussar Shmooze, the Mussar lecture. It wasn't a preachy, inspirational speech, but a profound Mussar clarification. There's the Vad, which is sort of like a workshop to clarify traits, character traits, and seek practical ways to inculcate them and acquire them. And above all, the Mussar movement was about the establishment of a Beis HaMussar, a house of Mussar, a designated room where people would study Mussar books by themselves. Now, these houses of Mussar were targeted at the lay people. They would come to study Mussar or hear a Mussar Shmooze, a Mussar lecture. Later on, as we will see, the Mussar movement is going to make a pivot to merging with the yeshiva movement that began at the time. Now, Reb Yisrael was essentially arguing for a whole new reframing of the nation. And like all revolutionaries in the Jewish world, he faced a hurdle in implementing his innovations. Jews are notoriously resistant to change, and that hampers all revolutionary ideas, both the good ones and the destructive ones. And specifically with Mussar, he faced an additional problem. The understanding at the time was that Mussar, that's for the common folk. It's for simpleton. It's very shallow. It's not deep. It's not profound. It's not for scholars. It's not for people of sophistication. So Rabbi Yisrael had to employ subterfuge to get his foot in the door. Now, he had already established himself as a great Gaon and otherworldly Torah scholar, and he would travel from town to town, and he would deliver Torah lectures on the highest level for the greatest scholars. And they would put announcements, post announcements. The great Gaon Reb Yisrael Salanter is going to come here on Wednesday night, and he'd give a great lecture, and they put a list of sources for people to read up on in advance. And all the great people of the town, all the Torah scholars of the town would assemble, and he would bedazzle them with genius and novel Torah insights. And at the end of the speech, he would segue into a fiery Mussar speech, a classic bait and switch. And there was a great story at the time where those that were resistant to Mussar, they knew his shtick, they knew what he did, and they decided to upend him. And so a couple days ahead of schedule, Reb Yisrael Salanter sends a list of sources for people to read up on. Maybe 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 different sources throughout Talmud and all the commentaries. So these people, they take the page down and they put up a new page. And they take nonsensical sources. They just write random pages of Talmud from all over that don't seem to have any connection or don't have any connection. And they hang it up instead. So for 2 days, all the people of town are preparing these sources, and it doesn't seem to have any connection, and that's because they're altered sources. So Reb Yisrael Salanter, he arrives, and of course he's bound to be tremendously ashamed by getting up there and talking about different sources or being stuck. So he gets there, and he looks at the sign, and he sees that someone altered the sources, and there's 10 or 20 different sources that he didn't send and he didn't prepare for. On the fly, as he's walking up and he prepares and he gathers his thoughts at the lectern, he crafted a new lecture based upon these made-up sources and was able to bedazzle the crowd. Nonetheless, he has such obviously this story is a mind-blowing story, but it shows his absolute command of every area, every nook and cranny of Torah, and his tremendous genius. So he goes on this pilgrimage, on this tour of popularizing and disseminating Mussar, and every place he gets to, he gives impassioned pleas. We have to establish a Beis HaMussar, a house of Mussar, a place where it's devoted. People come study Mussar on a regular basis, study works of Jewish ethics, and would infuse city upon city in Lithuania to take on the Mussar mantle. And the story is told that these houses of Mussar actually garnered a spiritual renewal all over the country. The great Rabbi Yitzchak Hutner once met an old Lithuanian Jew who still remembered Reb Yisrael Salanter, and he said that the most vile place of every town was the marketplace where they sold fish. He says the women who sold fish, they were cussing. They were the lowest. They were the lowlifes of society, and they would always speak in a really brutish way. And he said every city that had a base of Mussar, a house of Mussar that was influenced by Mussar, you wouldn't hear a single curse word in the fish marketplace for 50 years after Reb Yisrael Salanter dies. It doesn't mean that these women came to the Beis HaMussar. Rather, it means that there was a renewed atmosphere, a renewed connection to Torah and to Mussar and to character perfection that it influenced the entire city. In 1848, there was a horrific cholera epidemic in Vilna. And Reb Yisrael, he organized a makeshift hospital with 1,500 beds. He got doctors to work pro bono. He organized a Hatzalah, a task force of 60 Torah students, and he gave them clear instructions to take anyone to the hospital, even if it's on Shabbos. Don't allow a Gentile to do it, because you know why? Even though it's a prohibition to desecrate the Shabbos, but if someone's life is maybe at risk, and you dilly-dally and wait, maybe we get a Gentile to do it, then it's possible that the person may die. The Talmud is very severe about someone who hesitates and endangers others. And there's a story goes that one boy, he contracted cholera, and these students, they came and they took him on Shabbos, and eventually the child survived. And a week later, the child's father comes and thanks Reb Yisrael Salanter, but he says to him, I think you were a little bit too exaggerated by how much desecration of Shabbos you allowed. So Reb Yisrael responds, and he says, I took 60 young men, and I got them to volunteer to work all day with people that are deathly sick and highly contagious. And not a single one of them got sick. Not even one. Can you do that? Could you accept upon yourself that responsibility? Don't tell me that I'm being too lax with desecration of Shabbos, because an attitude like yours will get a lot of people killed. Now, that year, amid this raging epidemic, was the most sacred day of the year, Yom Kippur. So people that are ill, people who are susceptible to contracting illness, for them it might be very dangerous for them to fast on Yom Kippur. So Reb Yisrael Salanter put up signs that everyone has to eat on Yom Kippur, and that year he prepared cakes and cookies. And during the services after Shachris Yom Kippur, he gets up in the main synagogue and he makes kiddush and he drinks and he eats. And he says everyone else has to. It's a mitzvah for them to eat. And the logic, of course, is that suppose he just announces whoever feels a little bit faint should break their fast. Right? Had he said that, there would have been people, the pious people, the simple people of Vilna, that would have kept on fasting and endangered their lives. And in order to prevent those people from suffering, the fast had to be annulled for the entire community. That was his rationale. Now, after Yom Kippur, he was called to the rabbinical court, to the Beis Din of the city. And they tell him, we're not here to debate with you as to whether or not what you did was halachically sanctionable or not. But you should know that there is a Beis Din in town. There's a court. And you're one of the great rabbis of the whole world, and everyone knows that. But still, you shouldn't take into your own hands this kind of question. You bring it to us, and if you could convince us, then maybe we would have followed. But because you avoided us, it's improper. And they continue their admonishment by telling him, you deserve to be penalized, but we're not going to punish you. We want you to decide what punishment is appropriate. So Reb Yisrael responded. He says, if you want to consider penalizing me, I'm going to warn you that I'm going to nullify all the divorces, all the gittin, all the divorce documents that the Vilna Beis Din, that the Vilna court has performed over hundreds of years. Why? Because the Vilna Beis Din, it follows a procedure that was promulgated by one of the great halachic authorities, and I have an argument upon it that you cannot refute. And Reb Yisrael posed his argument. The rabbinical court could not refute it, and they said, you know what, we're not going to pick fights with you, and they just allowed him to go. That's the story of the cholera epidemic of 1848 and what happened in Yom Kippur. Now, around that same time, Reb Yisrael was offered to lead the rabbinical seminary founded in Lithuania by the Haskalah, by the Maskilim, and this was supported by the Russian government. If you remember, we mentioned the Haskalah, they would try to employ the government to try to achieve their religious, or more precisely, undoing the religions, their aims, their goals. And when they saw Reb Yisrael Salanter, they looked at him as though he was one of them. He, despite the fact that he was battling and scheming in ways to undo them, they thought he was an ally. He always was respectful, and he spoke about the beauty and the meaning of Judaism. He was always dressed immaculately. He was knowledgeable in foreign languages and other fields. He was clean. He was regal. And they said, you know what? To give it some legitimacy, let's have someone like Reb Yisrael Salanter head this new rabbinical seminary. And he rejected it. Later on, he said, he explained his rationale for rejecting this post by saying that in the regular world, someone who's capable becomes a physician. Well, why does he become a physician? Well, to make a living and to maybe become even rich. And therefore, what happens when there's two patients? One of them is rich, one's poor. Which one of them does he give more care, more health care to? The one who's rich, the one who's poor. Well, obviously, the rich person could pay more, so therefore he'll give more attention to the rich person. A rabbi in the Jewish people who studies Torah for its correct reasons, he doesn't have that same attitude. It's not about the rabbinate or the salary or wealth. When there's a poor person and a rich person that have a halachic question, he's going to work harder to help the poor person. Right? The poor person brings the food. Is it kosher or is it not kosher? Well, a Jewish rabbi, he tries to help the poor person more than helping earlier because that person has a greater need. That's what Torah is about. And to take Torah and relegate it to becoming a subject, a degree, a profession, that the rabbi should be like lawyers or physicians, I don't want to have any part of that. And he refused to accept the post, and then the education minister of Russia personally asked him to accept it. And that's one of those, an offer you can't refuse. But he refused it nonetheless, and he had to flee, and he moved out of Vilna, moved to Kovna. We know at that time he left Vilna, moved to Kovna. And some have argued that the real reason why he left Vilna was due to the fact that he had this massive conflict with the rest of the rabbis of the town, and he didn't want that to fester, so he moved. But regardless, both are true, and the only question is, what was his motivation to move to Kovna? Eventually, he moves to Kovna, and he continues the dissemination of the Mussar movement. He establishes a Mussar-focused yeshiva with a student body of approximately 150 students, and he founds a Mussar-based the Kovna Kollel, which is the first modern-day kollel. Married students continue their studies and receive a stipend. And many of the future Torah leaders were alumni of this Kovna Kollel, which continued until World War II. Now, after 10 years in Kovna in 1857 or 1858, he moved to Königsberg in Germany on a mission to revitalize German Jewry. Now remember, the Haskalah and the Reform hit Germany 50 years before it hit Russia, before it hit Lithuania. And he said that the Jews of Russia, they're in a tailspin. They're barreling down this proverbial slope of religious development. It's very difficult to change their course. They have so much velocity and momentum. However, German Jewry, well, they had already hit rock bottom, and they're primed to be nudged back up the hill. Maybe in absolute terms, the Jews of Lithuania, the Jews of Russia, are much better off, but in terms of who is more impressionable, it's likely that German Jewry is more impressionable. People that are totally gone from Torah and tradition are easier to move than those who are swiftly abandoning it. So he moved to Germany, and he learned to speak German, and he went to universities, and he gave lectures at universities, and he tried to get the universities to teach Talmud. He also spent time in Paris, which was even worse than the state in Germany. In Germany, at least you had pockets of orthodoxy with Torah Derech Eretz of Rav Hirsch. Paris, France, was a spiritual wasteland, devoid of Torah and bereft of yeshivos, lacking institutions of tradition. And he began a monumental effort to translate the Talmud into French. When that faced roadblocks, he made a Talmudic dictionary in French. He tried to get rabbis to settle there. And in 1883, Reb Yisrael Salanter died in Germany. Now, the Mussar movement, it outlived him. And towards the end of his life, as we mentioned earlier, it made a pivot and took on its most prominent form. Now, originally, the Mussar movement was targeted at lay people. Rabbi Yisrael did not attempt to inject it into the greatest yeshiva of the time, into Volozhin. But over the course of time, Rabbi Yisrael's own students established Mussar yeshivas on their own, most notably being Reb Simcha Zissel Ziv, a fascinating giant of Mussar known as the Alter of Kelm, the Elder of Kelm. He founded the famed Talmud Torah of Kelm, which was a small boutique yeshiva based upon Mussar principles. Circa 1880, another endlessly fascinating figure, Rabbi Nassim Tzvi Finkel, known as the Alter of Slobodka, the Elder of Slobodka. He was a student of the Alter of Kelm, and he founded what became the largest and most impactful Mussar yeshiva of them all, the famed Slobodka yeshiva. Stories told that before its founding, he approached Reb Yisrael and asked him what ought to be the essence of yeshiva. And Reb Yisrael responded with a verse in Isaiah, Lahachayos lev nitkaim, to inspire the heart of the depressed, to give life to the spirit of the Lord, to uplift a person and to breed men of great distinction and stature. So slowly, Mussar began to trickle into the yeshiva world. There was staunch opposition to Mussar in general, but that paled in comparison to the fierce opposition Mussar faced in yeshiva. We could have a whole series of talks about the battles and the wars over Mussar in the yeshivas in the 1880s and 1890s. In fact, the aforementioned Slobodka yeshiva, it had a schism, and it split into two separate yeshivos in 1897 over Mussar. But in the end, the opposition to Mussar and yeshivas fizzled out, and most of its opponents came around. It's not far-fetched to suggest that the opponents of Mussar, they reached the same conclusion that Rabbi Yisrael reached through his ingenuity a half a century earlier. He had such an intense understanding of where things are going that he arrived at the same destination just a lot earlier than everyone else did. Over time, Mussar conquered almost all the yeshivos and actually succeeded in safeguarding them from the threats of Haskalah and towards the end of the 19th century, socialism, which was sweeping away many of the Jewish youth. Infused by Mussar, the yeshiva movement experienced a true golden age that lasted until World War II. These yeshivos were headed by veritable giants of men and spawned legions of Torah greats and kept the beacon of Torah bright amid a nation that was disintegrating all around them. My grandfather wrote a letter outlining the history of Mussar Yeshivos and ends it as follows. Sikum advarim, the bottom line. Min hashamayim nishlach Rabbeinu Reb Yisrael Salanter shmasa Eden. From heaven, Reb Yisrael Salanter was sent lehatzil et hadorot habayim, to save the upcoming generations, LaTorah for Torah, al yidei derech chinuch hamusari shehu chidash, through the new Mussar pedagogical approach that he innovated, that he invented, v'talmidav hagdolim pitchuhu, and that was further developed by his great students. This is going to be the final Jewish History Podcast episode before the high holidays and the Festival of Sukkot. We're going to be off until the second week in October, God willing. And I wish all the listeners and the whole Jewish people to have a happy and healthy and sweet new year. As always, please email me at rabbiwolbe@gmail.com. Share these podcasts with your friends. And I thank you all.